Well, our reading of the text of Machiavelli has come to an end, and it's time for me to try to put everything we've looked at into some sort of broader historical context. Obviously, we've had to glance backward as far as ancient Rome and occasionally even ancient Greece to talk about the writings of this Renaissance thinker, Niccolò Machiavelli. Now, of course, what we need to do is go forward and to take a look and say what happens to those writings from the time that Machiavelli penned them until now, especially looking at the first few centuries since Machiavelli wrote. And that's what I'm going to focus on, the larger way that Machiavelli impacted not just his own immediate world in Florence, but the larger world of the Western political tradition and the Western political Republican tradition. I mentioned already that none of the works that we looked at in detail was published in Machiavelli's lifetime. The Prince, in fact, was published in 1532 for the first time, 5 years after Machiavelli's death, and the Discourses in 1531, 4 years after Machiavelli's death. Remember, of course, these works are written in Italian, and although Italian was a well-known language in Western Europe because of the prominence of Italy in terms of its being the origin of Renaissance thought, nevertheless, it is important to remember when they were first published, they were known in Italy. They were known locally. They were not often well received. In particular, in 1559, the Pope put all of Machiavelli's works on the index of prohibited books. Catholics were not allowed to read these books. Now, we all know, then and now and long before the 16th century, not everybody who was Catholic obeyed papal decrees. And so, in fact, Machiavelli was read, but he was essentially labeled officially a bad guy. He was immoral because he taught that cruelty could be a good thing, or that lying and deceiving were good things sometimes in certain circumstances, necessary in certain circumstances to achieve goals that were worth achieving. And that didn't set well, obviously, with a church that taught a traditional morality. The Ten Commandments, the Beatitudes, and so on and so forth. So Machiavelli was forbidden. Let's not also forget that Machiavelli says a lot of not nice things about popes. I mentioned, for example, in the last lecture what he said about Pope Sixtus IV, or actually the next to last lecture, what he said about Pope Sixtus IV. And so in this era, after all, remember, of the emergence of various Protestant groups in Europe that were seen as a real challenge to Catholic teaching, Machiavelli is a guy, you really would like to shut up, both for his moral teaching, or lack thereof, and for his, in no doubt the way some people saw it, trashing of the papacy. But not only did Catholics dislike, or at least official Catholics dislike Machiavelli, so did Protestants. Protestants thought that Machiavellian principles were behind a lot of bad things that happened to Protestants. In particular, in 1572, in France, was an event still famous or infamous in history called the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, in which many Protestants were killed. The Queen of France at that time was Catherine de' Medici. Her father was that Lorenzo de' Medici to whom the prince had been dedicated. And so many drew the conclusion that it's these Machiavellian teachings, these Machiavellian principles, obviously meaning primarily the prince, that encouraged or gave people a kind of permission to carry out a massacre of Protestants. So it's true that Machiavelli was translated into French in the 16th century. Nevertheless, it's important to realize, not surprisingly, that from different quarters, Machiavelli didn't get a very good reception. We're going to go from there, however, to England and talk about Machiavelli in England. Because by the end of the 16th century, Machiavelli dies in 1527, by the end of the 16th century, the word Machiavel, later on Machiavellian, had entered the English language as a word, and it was not, as you can guess, a nice word. It was a word that meant someone who was cynical and dishonest. In many ways, something similar to what the word often means today. So we want to focus in a little bit on how that word, and therefore the concept of what Machiavelli's thought consisted of, existed in England by around 1600. The great Renaissance dramatist, Christopher Marlowe, actually has a character named Machiavel in one of his plays, a play called The Jew of Malta. And therefore, Machiavel has some lines. Let me quote a couple of them. "I count religion but a childish toy," Machiavel says. And later on, he says that there is no sin but ignorance. These are very important things for us to note, because from those lines that this character utters, we get an idea what Machiavellian was coming to mean. And we see that it's not necessarily an accurate description even of the prince, let alone of Machiavelli's thought generally. Okay, first of all, religion is but a childish toy. Machiavelli doesn't say that. We need to be much more subtle and much more nuanced about what Machiavelli does say. He certainly has a certain cynicism toward the Catholic Church of his own day. By the way, he was not alone. Let's remember, he was an exact contemporary, born a few years before, an exact contemporary of Martin Luther. Or for that matter, of the great humanist in the North, Erasmus, who, after all, wrote a satirical piece that when Pope Julius II got to heaven, or got to the gate of heaven, Peter threw him out and threw him to hell. So, although it is certainly true that Machiavelli has a somewhat sinister look and cynical look at the practices of the Catholic Church in his own day, and he's interested in church things as they teach us about or relate to the politics of Florence and of Italy. All those things are true. But certainly he never says that, religion is simply, it almost sounds Marxist the way that this character Machiavel says that, religion is the opiate of the people. It's used as a drug to keep them under control. Machiavelli never quite says that. And again, as I've said several times in the lectures, there's no particular reason to think that Machiavelli was unbelieving in God, and there are reasons to think he was a believer in God. He certainly wasn't interested in details of Christian doctrine, and he certainly didn't follow traditional Christian morality very closely himself, although one could always say, which of us does? But nevertheless, it's certainly not a fair statement of the historical figure Machiavelli to say, or have come out of his mouth, that religion is but a childish toy. Secondly, again, he's quoted in this character as saying there's no sin but ignorance. The implication, therefore, is that, there's a total amorality. There are no rights and wrongs. There are no standards. But even when he talks about cruelty, and cruelty well used, he says it may be something that's politically beneficial, but it will never win you glory. There is a sense in Machiavelli that there is some sort of moral order. It's not the moral order that he's received from tradition. And furthermore, Machiavelli's talking about public conduct. He's not talking about personal conduct. He isn't telling dads or husbands or moms or friends to follow the conduct that he prescribed for a prince in The Prince. It's for a prince, after all. It's not a universal new moral, or lack of, moral code. But it is interesting to note how very quickly, again, we're dealing with the same century in which Machiavelli wrote The Prince, it's interesting to see how quickly this reputation of the sort of evil, cynical, amoral, atheistic Machiavellian figure comes along. Shakespeare, too, develops several Machiavellian characters that are clearly built on that same understanding of what Machiavellian means. Literary critics will point especially to King Richard II, King Richard III, and the character of Iago in Othello as examples of Machiavellian characters. Now, as a historian, I don't get to teach those plays. But every semester in a Western humanities course that my university requires of all students, I do teach Hamlet. And therefore, I've thought a lot about, perhaps not as obviously as regard to Richard II, Richard III, and Iago, but I've thought about how Shakespeare uses ideas from Machiavelli in Hamlet. And I think a couple things strike me as interesting. One is that it seems to me one of the problems of Hamlet is there are a whole bunch of people trying to be Machiavellian in that traditional definition that we're getting. And that would include perhaps most obviously Claudius or Polonius, but it also includes Hamlet. Although, by the way, Hamlet isn't very good at it. And I think it's interesting because one of the questions that raises is, it may be that Machiavelli wrote a book for princes, but Machiavelli can't control the fact that people might say, in my business, in my personal life, in my subordinate job, I can take on those practices too and move forward. And I think one of the questions, perhaps indirectly, that Shakespeare is asking is, what happens if everybody tries to play by those rules? And we see it in Polonius because Polonius is, of course, spying on Hamlet, and that's sort of part of his job in the court of Denmark. But equally, he spies on his son Laertes. He sends a spy to Paris, and he says to the spy, when you get to Paris, lie about my son in order to get the truth. By indirections, find directions out. And Hamlet himself, in Act 4, at one point says, sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. Well, gosh, those seem like words lifted out of Machiavelli. But this has to do with the way Hamlet's treating his mother, for example. So I think that what we can appreciate in some of the English literature is this almost stock character of what Machiavel or Machiavellian means. And I would argue, unfortunately, that's the way many people today still think of Machiavelli. He's the inventor of dissimulation. He's the inventor of cynicism, nastiness, and complete disregard of religious truths and moral values and all that sort of stuff. And that's not to blame the English playwrights. They had no control over what we think 400 years later, after all. They couldn't anticipate that. But I think it's too bad because we've made Machiavelli such a one-dimensional figure, and I hope if I've shown nothing else in the first 22 lectures, Machiavelli is a much more complex and multidimensional and subtle thinker than we would gather from the adjective Machiavellian or the characters of those Elizabethan dramas. There continues to be this reputation problem that Machiavelli had, because if we look back at people in history who have said, I've used Machiavelli, I've read Machiavelli, I've kept Machiavelli by my bedside. Let me give you three names. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, Napoleon, and, perhaps less surprisingly, Benito Mussolini. Well, whatever you think of any of those guys, they tend not to be the great heroes of the Western world. They all are, of course we could say this about anybody, seriously flawed characters. And we're a little bit nervous if that's the crowd Machiavelli keeps, or if that's the kind of leader Machiavelli has inspired and guided. I think that makes people nervous. And in fact, in the 18th century, a couple very important 18th century characters actually wrote works against Machiavelli, which of course means, okay, he wrote in the 16th century. We go 200 years later, he's an important enough figure that people are still worried about him. The King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, wrote an anti-Machiavellian work, as did the French philosopher and writer Voltaire. So the prince has, rightly or wrongly, had a tough reputation that spread to Machiavelli generally over the course of the centuries, beginning shortly after his death. But now, let's turn to that book that we know has not been as influential and famous, The Discourses, this major work of Republican political thought. And what I'm going to try to argue in most of the remainder of this lecture is that the Discourses came to be a source for, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, Republican political thought and its development, especially in England and later on in the New World in what became the United States. And therefore, we're looking at a more positive, although more subtle and more contained in intellectual discourse, influence of the Machiavelli of the Discourses, which I argued from the beginning, and I think most Machiavelli scholars would, is really his most considered and greatest book. This is the part of the story of the heritage of Machiavelli we don't often hear. And I do want to point out that the great book that opened this up to us is a book called The Machiavellian Moment, written by a scholar named J.G.A. Pocock. The book came out a little over 30 years ago, and it's a very interesting book. It's incredibly hard to read. His style is, how do we say this, academic and perhaps a bit obtuse. He quotes things in several different languages. This is not a book I think I would give to undergraduates unless I gave them a small snippet. Long sentences, sometimes convoluted arguing. But it's one of those books where after you struggle through it and curse at it a couple times along the way, you say, damn it, there's a lot of stuff in there. Damn it, there's substance here. And the subtitle of the book is Florentine Political Thought and the Atlantic Republican Tradition. And in fact, Pocock's book has created a sort of new body of scholarship that's looked at Machiavelli as a serious contributor to the development of Republican thought in the West, in particular in the English-speaking West, that is to say in England and in the United States. So let's talk about that side of the influence of Niccolo Machiavelli. First of all, before Machiavelli was read in England, first in French translation and then translated into English in the 17th century, Machiavelli was read and written about and incorporated into the thought of Italian political thinkers. That is to say, Florentines and others read Machiavelli from the time it was published and began to comment on him, borrow from him, refute parts of what he said. He becomes part of the political dialogue of Italy before he does in England. And one of the things that happens in the writers of the generation after Machiavelli is that A, some of his original ideas are incorporated into a broader political tradition. I mean, we see how, in many ways, shockingly, radically different Machiavelli is, how stunning he is, and how deliberately provocative he is. But other writers can take some of that, in a sense, smooth off perhaps what they see as the rough edges, and say, wait a minute, Machiavelli says this, but we can fit this into an older and broader political argument, a broader paradigm, without taking all of Machiavelli or without discarding so much of traditional political thought. He can be fused and incorporated into, with again some smoothing and the rejection of some elements of Machiavelli's thought. And so it's first in Italy that Machiavelli becomes a source for further political discourse and incorporated into the broader discussions of political issues, rather than this guy who just seems to stand apart. who just seems to say no to almost every traditional yes. That's an important thing to say. Before I get to England and America, let me, to some extent, recall and to some extent rephrase and broaden some of the important points of Machiavelli's thought as they're going to be received in England in the 17th century and in America in the 18th century. First of all, we've talked about the originality of the development of the idea of virtu, that his definition of virtue is not simply, the Boy Scout or Girl Scout oath. It's not about being thrifty, brave, clean, and reverend, and so on. It is a very different understanding. Someone who, when necessity requires it, is willing to be cruel, is willing to be a dissimulator in order to achieve a goal. You don't do it gratuitously, but you do it if it's in fact necessary to reach your goal. You need to have the outcome in mind and then figure out how you get to the outcome that you have formulated. This is an important principle that does become incorporated into Western thought. Secondly, Machiavelli takes the ideas of Aristotle and Polybius, two important early thinkers, I've mentioned them both several times before, about the idea of a mixed constitution. And he redoes much of what they say. He starts with their basic idea of what a republic is, that is to say, a mixed government of elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, as we've talked about, but he systematically discusses it, and of course he brings it up to date. He is able to apply it to modern political entities and say how they do or do not express that classic Republican thought. And so he sort of reintroduces and reshapes this idea of mixed constitution into political thought in the 16th century. Another important thing is, we've talked about this before, Machiavelli's new / return to the classics idea of fortuna or fortune. As long as fortune means something like fate, as long as it means something that God has put under the control of the spinning wheel, there's a kind of fatalism about it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If the wheel of fortune always spins, then when you're at the top, inevitably you're going to go down. And when you're down at the bottom, you're inevitably going to spin back up. Well, remember that Machiavelli, in a sense, dissociated the idea of fortuna from fate, and went back to a more classical idea that fortune is something indeed that comes from the outside, but it's not something over which we have no control. Again, the image that fortune is a river. You can't stop the water, but you can build the dikes and the levees and the dams and all the rest of it. And what that's done is to change the way that people think about historical causation. Because it's easy to say, oh, well, no wonder, this entity fell or this battle was lost because, well, the wind blew. Or whatever it might be, it rained. Or these guys had something happen to them that really charged them up. And we sort of say there was no control over that. It was just, that's the way that battle was going to end. But Machiavelli says, no, in fact, fortune can be controlled, not eliminated, by foresight, by positive action, by taking risk. And when you do that, you put more of the causes of things that happen in the world into human hands and less into something, whether you call it God or fate or whatever it is, but less into the hands of something beyond human control, beyond human devices. And so essentially, in a Christian context, he therefore has the effect of shall we say, secularizing causation in history. If we want to know the cause, don't start with storms. Talk about the way people prepared for storms. Because humans can have some control over fortune. Humans need to take risk, and risk is a better way to deal with fortune than simply standing back and waiting for things to happen. Be bold. And so we put more in human hands. And over time, that secularization of causation will develop in England and then later on in the United States as the notion that the great damager of cultures and governments is corruption. and corruption's in human hands. Now, Machiavelli doesn't say, I'm replacing X with corruption. Doesn't say that at all. But I want you to see that Machiavelli has sort of started a process of the secularization of causation that later on will lead to an emphasis on corruption, an emphasis, by the way, that you will find in such places as, well, by golly, the Federalist Papers. Now, let me turn to England. Even before the death and execution of King Charles I, bringing an temporary end to the English monarchy, there were some political thinkers in England who argued that England had a mixed constitution because, well, it's like a classic republic, they said. Okay, because we've got king, we've got the House of Lords, and we have the House of Commons. See? Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. Not exactly what the Roman Republic was like, but there was an attempt to try to bring Republican thought into line and bring it to bear on England in the first half of the 17th century. However, it was only after the monarchy was destroyed, of course temporarily, there was no king for 11 years between 1649 and 1660, that Machiavelli and Republican thought from Italy became more directly relevant. And the key figure in all this is an Englishman named James Harrington, who in 1656 published a book called Oceana. And one of the reasons that Machiavelli enters into his thought about the nature of governance and the state in the interregnum is because he needed to justify the existence of an armed people during the interregnum. And of course, what does Machiavelli argue in both the Prince and the Discourses in different ways? In the Prince, he says princes should arm the people. In the Discourses, he said Rome armed its citizens. And even when it captured some places, it would, in certain circumstances, arm citizens. And so that discussion of the relationship between a republic and an armed people, which is a contribution that Machiavelli makes, because as Machiavelli said, what everybody said up to now is you disarm people. Machiavelli says, no, that doesn't work at all. Furthermore, what we find in Harrington is an argument for civic virtue and participation. And think about what Machiavelli says about the people and the role of the people and the superiority of the people, especially in the Discourses, but even in some less direct and obvious ways in the Prince. So these are some of the most important points we find in English political thought. In the United States, that is to say in America before the Revolution, I don't want to use the term United States and use it anachronistically, as we look at the development of political thought in the 18th century, and as we especially look to the establishment of the Constitution and the great writing for our Constitution, that is to say the Federalist Papers, we again find elements of Italian civic humanist thought generally, and Machiavelli in particular, in our American literature and in our American institutions. First of all, we know how important to America it is that we have the separation of powers. And if we think back to some of the Republican thought of Machiavelli in the Prince, rather in the Discourses, he emphasizes that this is a mixed constitution where different people, the consuls, the Roman Senate, and the offices of the tribunes and the assemblies representing the people have different functions in government, and they check one another. Now, we, of course, don't have a formal aristocracy in the United States, but we do have a system of separation of powers, a system of checks and balances. This is something related to important Machiavellian themes. Again, whether our forefathers got this directly from Machiavelli, probably not. What they did is, however, get it from the literature that did incorporate elements of Machiavelli's thought from England and earlier on in the colonial period, where obviously it was England derived. Secondly, the United States is built on principles of active participation. Again, go back to what Machiavelli says in the Discourses, and a sense of the common good. Think about the speech that I talked about in Machiavelli's Histories, where he talks about leaving behind the special good, the special interest, the individual good, and coming to the common good, a point he made about Cosimo de' Medici, for example. Also, part of the American way of thinking has to do with an image of Americans as armed men operating patriotically. The Order of the Cincinnati was, after all, the alumni organization, if you will, of the Revolutionary War, named for the great Roman hero Cincinnatus. Now, certainly people read Livy in the early American history, but a lot of what they understood about Livy was mediated by Machiavelli and through Machiavelli. The Americans pride themselves on being an armed, active citizenry. And if you read the Federalist Papers, you discover there's a great fear of corruption, and our Constitution's been built to catch it as much as possible. That's Machiavellian, too.